evening. Tonight is Monday, January 6th, and we do have a quorum, so I will call this meeting to order. The first order of business is agenda approval. Do I have a motion to approve the agenda for tonight's work session meeting?
So second. I'm sorry.
We will vote to approve our agenda. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Tonight's agenda is approved. Our first item up for discussion tonight is to hear the results of the EPS 2024 resident survey conducted by the Morris Leatherman Group. I'd like to welcome up Peter Leatherman of the Morris Leatherman Group and Dr. Stanley to lead us through the discussion. Peter?
Thanks. Chair Gablet. I appreciate that. I'm really excited to have Peter here to provide an overview. We actually run the survey about every year to 18 months with the community. It's a statistically valid and reliable survey, and questions are oftentimes similar. We may add some additional questions in to get a better understanding of the information, but Peter will be able to share the dates that the survey was ran, and he will go through the information in detail, and there will be an opportunity for your initial reactions, questions, responses.
Super. It's a pleasure to be here. I see new faces now on the school board. This is probably only my 20th iteration of the Edina School Board over the years. Since it's a work session and there's a lot of information, feel free, if you have a question on a specific slide, to say, let's have a clarification. Said we get to slide 24 and something doesn't make sense. So feel free to interrupt me at any time. To review with you what we undertook, and it's been pretty standard now over the years. It varies a little bit if you're looking at funding requests for the years. We spoke with 400 randomly selected residents across the school district. And then within that sample, there's approximately 25% are parents. So there's about 100 parents in the 400 sample. So then we call an additional 300. I pull out the 100 parents in the main sample, put those together, and now we have a statistically valid sample of 400 of parents. It's a savings to the district. I don't have to call two individual samples of 400. We have 100 that are overlap. Each sample is projectable to plus or minus 5% and 95 out of 100 cases. The margin of error is determined by the size of the sample, not the percent of the population. So a 400 in the school district, a 400 in Hennepin County, or a 400 in the state of Minnesota is always plus or minus 5%. Average interview time was 13 minutes. We waited till after the election, so people were more than happy to chat with us. It was all over. So the non-response rate was 6.5%, and you can see the dates were between the 7th and 22nd of November. Putting up some demographics so you can see the profile of both surveys. For the purpose of the presentation, the overall results are blue, the parent results are green. How long has the person lived in the school district? In the overall sample, the typical resident's been in the community for about 16 years. For parents, it comes in at about 8 years. In the overall, 12% of the community has a preschooler or an infant. Amongst parents, it's 31%. The community as a whole, as you can see, is 25% households attending the Edina Public Schools. 71% then are empty nesters. And once again, empty nester does not indicate an age, it's lack of presence of a child. So we could have a 24-year-old in here. If they don't have a child, they're an empty nester. So in the overall results, your core constituency is about 1 in 4. Continuing with the demographics, the median age for a resident of the community is about 48 years old. For parents, it's about 36 years old. Highly educated in Edina, just short of a majority are college graduates. In the overall sample, 60% of parents are college graduates, and that includes master's degrees, advanced degrees beyond a 4-year bachelor. Ethnicity, the parent community is more diverse than the community as a whole. 72% overall indicated white, 63% amongst parents, with 17% African American amongst parents, 6% Hispanic Latino, 9% Asian Pacific Islander, and 5% indicated that they were something else or multiracial. Men and women were separated by 2 points, more home ownership amongst parents. Overall in the community, just over 1 in 5 are renters. Amongst parents, it's about 1 in 8. Any questions on methodology, demographics? All right. The survey says, and I'm going to start the caveat up front for those that have been on the board, you can see the trend that happened between 20 and 21, okay? Public opinion on quality on education as a whole, it's apples and oranges to compare it back to what it was before the pandemic. Just as a note, you saw the drop in the excellent rating. What you continue to see if we combine the favorable, it was 93% in 2020. It's now 90% in 2024. It's just a shift in enthusiasm. And that's what's happened across the state. The typical drop right now is about 35% from what the excellent rating was to what it is currently. There's only one school district that actually has a higher excellent rating today than they did before the pandemic. Everybody else, the norm drop is about 35%. What you have gone against trend and what we're seeing in the last 18 months is the shift from good to only fair. The norm favorable rating right now is 80%, which means 20% in school districts are rating the quality of education as only fair. You have a wall. They've shifted from excellent to good, but you don't have that spillover now into the only fair poor category. The norm excellent rating, which differentiates school districts, before the pandemic, the norm was 22%. So you were more than double at 50%. The norm right now is 11%. So you're almost 3 times the norm. But you have that drop, but you don't have the spillover now into the unfavorable category. When people think about the Edina schools, what do they like most? The next 2 questions are open-ended. They can tell us anything and we collapse them down into categories. Both groups combine to have at the top good teachers, 23 and 26%. But if we combine some categories and we look at the programming side, what's being taught, the variety of programs and the broad curriculum brings it up to 25 and 24%. Basically a statistical tie with the teachers. Then combine the quality of the academics, the excellent academics, the good academics, high test scores. That actually combines both categories to about 30%. So you do have, these are the normal 3 categories. It varies from district to district. Some are very centered on programming, some on quality, some on personnel. You've always had a real tight range between the 3. But what always leads the list in Edina, going back to the 90s, is the overall academic quality provided in the schools. What's the most serious issue facing the district? High taxes, right at the top. That is a 2022 change that we saw. Everybody got their assessment in the spring of 22 and they were happy. Things were up 20-25%, and I swear only about 5 people in the entire state realized what that was going to do to their taxes. November 15th of 2022, somebody flipped the light switch on. And so before 22, the norm on high taxes had gone down to about 8%. The norm now is 15 to 20%, and it's probably going to go higher now with what's happened in many communities. The lack of funding, typically it's about 1 in 5 in school districts currently. You do have a heightened awareness in this district of staff shortages. That has been growing. The pandemic exacerbated that in 21, 22, but that 14% is about double than what we typically see. Everything else is in single digits. The key is you still have at the bottom a reservoir of goodwill, the nothing. Those are boosters. There are no problems in the school district. Before the pandemic, the norm was about 10% boosters, about 1 in 10. We're down to about 5%. right now, boosters. So you're about 5X on the community as a whole, and 1 in 5 parents are core boosters. It's a great position to be.
A question on the taxes, because this is their statement, that it wasn't asked
Correct.
where you
It's
gave them
open-ended.
choices, this is their statement.
Yep.
But they didn't necessarily differentiate between
No.
the high taxes related to the school district versus the overall tax burden they're experiencing in property taxes.
No.
Okay.
Most people have, you know,
They
some,
don't get-
yeah, we'll go in depth sometimes in city, county, school district. It's just like people don't know the difference between operating levy and a bond referendum.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
It's
thank you
the,
for-
yeah.
Thank you for that clarification.
Now, we saw that shift in the quality of education from excellent to good. How do people think it's moving though compared to 3 years ago? We're not pitting it against 2020 or 2019. It's not a fair comparison. From basically the pandemic kind of winding down in 21, you do have a lot of people think that there's still positive momentum. So 46% say it's better than 3 years ago to 6% worse. It's better than a 7-to-1 ratio. The norm right now is 3-to-1. On parents, it's a 50-to-9 ratio. So even if there are concerns or diminishing enthusiasm, people do see momentum that things are improving when it comes to the quality. How does the district do on meeting the learning needs of all students? Some, only some or very few. That 60% is very strong. The norm right now, it's dropped. The pandemic caused it to drop. The norm's about 45%. Amongst parents, it's 52%. It's a stringent standard to say all students' learning needs are being met. So the key takeaway is it's an outstanding rating, one of the top 2 that we have in the last 2 years. Now, we do follow up with those that say some or very few and say what type of students' learning needs are not being met. It is the underachiever, it's the struggling student. And that has been the theme of the pandemic. That's where the concern is. You know, I always say, 30 years ago when I started doing this, it was all about gifted and talented. Then it was the average student being lost 15 years ago. Now it's really a concern about underachieving and struggling students. How concerned are they about learning loss during the pandemic? Overall in the community, it's abated a bit. We asked this question for the first time last year. It's down about 8 points. It's now 45% saying they're either very or somewhat, 55% not to or not at all. There is more concern amongst parents, 56 to 43, but that's come down a little bit. So the concern on the learning loss, and this kind of dovetails into the momentum. Do they think it's better or worse? We saw a vast majority saying it's getting better than worse. So it's starting to be abated. What's the most important indicator of a high quality education? And we gave them these 6 options. They could tell us when they think of a high quality school district, what's the most important indicator? It's the broad curriculum serving all. We already saw it earlier, just in the top of the mind response, followed by the number of students going on for further education, the reasonable number in classrooms, standardized test scores, and state-of-the-art technology. Now, test scores, one note, that has dropped a little bit in Edina. And so what we saw in the last couple of years is that go to about 25%. Going back in the day, to the days of W, with No Child Left Behind, it was a big demand to test kids all the time. And then people got exhausted with testing kids all the time, and it wasn't the most accurate indicator. What we found in the data now is, especially for non-parents, test scores are the touch point into a school district. And that's what gets the press, that's what shows up on social media posts, newspaper headlines, all those sorts of things. It's abated a little bit. 5 years ago, that number was in single digits, even in Edina. So it's still there in the background. But the 3 primary are the broad curriculum, those going on for further education, and the reasonable number in classrooms. This is what's important. Now, how do they rate the Edina School District on each indicator? Well, let's go. The number 1 was broad curriculum serving all. 90% favorable overall, amongst parents, 87%. The next was graduates going on for further education, 87 and 92%. The top two overwhelmingly positively rated with Edina. The third one is always kind of the hangup, is the class size issue. Still though, you had 67% rating them reasonable overall, amongst parents, 61%. Now, the key word on this is reasonable, because what's reasonable to me, graduating from Blaine High School in 1990, and somebody that graduated from Bewabic in 1990 is completely different. That's what it's based on, is a person's experience. So this is more of a notion. So overall though, it still nets out positive as opposed to negative on that. And then standardized test scores, very high, 86 and 92%. And then technology, you saw technology, everybody's kind of exhausted by technology since the pandemic, very concerned. So it's always technology. The key was in working on the tech levy here in 2021, it was all about technology in the classroom, but it's highly rated, 91 and 88%. Description of the Edina Public Schools. Do they agree that the description applies? The highest rated is the promotion of excellence, 96% in each category. High achieving, 94 and 92. An educational leader, 86, 92. The district focused on equity and inclusion, 82, 89. Willing to take risks, 84, 83, and meeting the needs of all, 86 and 79. We already talked about meeting the learning needs of all with that, but still, the theme, the brand of Edina that people agree with, they still see, is the promotion of excellence, high achieving, and an educational leader. Which is the most important of the description, is committed to meeting the learning needs of all. It goes back to what they value, the most importantly. Everything else pales in comparison. We asked about 6 areas of study, and we asked if this is a very important area for students in Edina Public Schools, somewhat important, not too important, not at all important. What's the rate on the chart is the very important. Because if we add in the somewhat important, it's 81% combined or higher. So all of them are at least somewhat important. The hierarchy comes in looking at the intense, very important category. And it's STEAM, both samples agree, 76 and 66%. Work-based learning, exploring career pathways, early learning, transition program, and global studies. Now, that doesn't mean that global studies is not a priority, because if we combine in the somewhat important, it's over 80%. This just shows you the hierarchy in the minds, and they actually mesh. The community's importance and focus areas meshes with the parents. Are there concerns about curriculum? This has been a standard question that we've asked in Edina since the Center for the American Experiment back in 2017, and it really hasn't changed. It's been about 80% of people saying no, it's not a concern. Amongst parents, it's 82%. If we ask those that said yes, they have concerns, what are their concerns? Too liberal, 9 and 8%. Gender identity, LGBT, scattered, and then unsure. So it's been pretty standard that there's about 8 out of 10 people that do not have concerns. Overall rating of technology opportunities in the district, 81% favorable in the community overall, amongst parents, 89%. Some specific perceptions of the district. First off, does the district spend taxpayers' money effectively and efficiently? The district maintains its rating of over 80%. The norm on this right now is at 59%. So you're almost 25% higher than the norm on this question. Are the schools a good value for the investment? Absolutely. It's never been a question here. Better than 90%. Have you spent past referendum funds responsibly? Absolutely. Better than 80%. Norm on this comes in at about 70%. So you're about 10 points higher than the norm. What about, are you held accountable enough for the education provided to students? Absolutely. The high, going back to 22, almost 90%. Really, really impressive movement on this question. This one really has lagged behind recovery of the pandemic. And the question is basically the district does a good job of involving the community in decisions. Obviously, in 2021, it was really difficult to involve the community in anything. And so the norm dropped down to about 65% from 75%. It's come back up, but it's come back up into about the 70, 75% range. You're almost at 90% agreeing with that. That people do have a sense of feeling that they can have a say, a sense of empowerment. Are they satisfied with decision making? Well, you can see the further we get away from the pandemic and all the decisions that had to be made, the better people feel about decision making. 81 to 13, almost a 7-to-1 ratio on that. This is outstanding. The norm on that right now is about 4-to-1.
Can I just have a clarifying question? Go back to 2 slides. The spent past referendum responsibility. Can you just clarify that once again? The question is based on, did we, in past referendums, did we spend it properly? Is that what it means?
Yes, yes.
Okay,
The district has spent past referendum funds responsibly.
great, thank you.
Last set of perceptions. Do they trust you to do what's right for the children? Absolutely, up to 90%. Are they proud and would recommend the Edina Public Schools? Absolutely, 89%. And in discussing potential funding requests in 2025, we asked the question, the schools are a good value, a good investment, and I would support a property tax increase to protect that investment. The key on this question is always the disagreement, because that tells you the core opposition. We're not telling them if it's an operating levy or a bond referendum, if it's $50 a month or $50 a year. In concept, the core no. You have 16% disagreeing with that. The norm last year in all the referendums we worked on was 30%, core no. That's getting to the high side, which is why we only saw 41% of referendum funding requests pass last year, because that core no started to grow based on primarily property tax issues. So this doesn't mean everything would pass. It simply means the lower that number is, the more willingness there is to have a discussion. You don't have the reflex of, I'm against this because I'm against a property tax increase.
Peter, do you have just off the top of your head how those numbers have, I mean, the blue line pretty consistent, but going back even further back, have we had much above 16 for opposition?
Oh, you've been in the 20s before.
We have.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. Especially, I go back to the Jesse Ventura. Yeah, you have to go back.
Okay.
Yeah. Go back 25 years. And in that time period, typically it's been in that 15 to low 20s range. You've always had a public that's willing to have the discussion. They're not the reflexive no. Job performance ratings across the board, outstanding. On the school board, 75-20. The norm right now is 58-40. On the administration and superintendent, 76-20. It's almost a 4-to-1 ratio. And the norm ratio right now is 2-to-1 positive. It continues, though, this also shows me that the district, and it always has been the case here, I can always tell a dysfunctional school district if the board's high and the administration's low, or vice versa. The community's picking up on dissonance. It's basically a 1-for-1. They see it as a unit, the governance and the administration. Closer you get to the kids, more favorability, and we see that principals 82, teachers 90%. Teachers are about 10 points higher than the norm. The norm dropped during the pandemic on teachers, where it was typically between 90 and 95%. The norm right now is about 82%. So an outstanding rating on teachers. Overall assessment of financial management then, 74% favorable. The norm on this right now is 52%. So if we look at the fiscal credibility of the district, it remains in good stead, looking back at all the questions throughout the survey that are seated on financial management. A few questions on a potential funding request. First off, if they heard the district was going to ask for a property tax increase, are they for all? Are they against all? Or are they persuadable? You actually have 3% more support at the outset than core opposition, 22% to 19%. The key is obviously going to be the 58%. Where you're atypical on this, and what we've seen, in the 90s, we used to have 80% say they're persuadable and 20% said, because keep in mind, we haven't told them what the funds are going to be used for. I say these people have made up their mind with absolutely no information. They're either for it or against it, regardless of the information. We're down now in 22 and 23. The norm persuadable right now is 45%, which means more than half the people have made up their mind with no information. You have a lot more persuadable people than we've seen in many years in the district, and a lot less in the position that they've already made up their mind. But those that have made up their mind, it's 3% more supporters to opposition. Now, our let's make a deal question, if they heard the district was going to ask for a tax increase for a bond referendum, what's a reasonable dollar amount? First off, the nothing. We always want that to be below 35%. You're at 20%. 17% say $5 a month. 23% say $10 a month. We have 31% that say $15 a month or higher. The norm comes in, the median comes in right at about 12 bucks a month, about 150 bucks a year at the outset. Now, is that number set in stone? Absolutely not. It's meant to give you an indication. The further you go from that number, the more difficulty there is in passing it. But the most important thing is not only the number, but what the funding's used for. So that's why we went through a list of 4 things and asked, would you support a property tax increase for each of these purposes? You can see you have support, majority support for everything. You have extraordinarily high support for safety and security, early learning space, and the transition program space. Even on sustainability and green initiatives, 58-36. You don't have anything that's a deal killer, where I come in and it has 40% support, 55% opposition. That then drives down the dollar amount people will support. But any sort of package that primarily is focused on the top 3 would have a great chance of success.
Peter, when you ask this question, do you define for respondents what a transition program is?
We told them. Space for a transition program for 18 to 22-year-olds with special needs.
Perfect. Thank you.
And then it would just, so everybody, then safety and security improvements, additional space for the early learning, and sustainability and green initiatives such as electric buses and the infrastructure required to support them. Finally, turning to communications. How informed do people feel about decisions that the district makes? This time around, 78% overall. If we go look at the blue bar, rates it positively. Amongst parents, it goes to 93%. The norm for the community right now, there's been a disconnect. The pandemic, especially for non-parents disconnected all over the place. And actually, I just stated, yeah, even from city, we just see higher levels of uncertainty. They're not focused. State issues, international issues, federal issues, that was the focus. So the norm on the variant somewhat informed right now is about 65%. Parents are your harshest critics because they need to be informed a lot. They need information. So the norm on the parents is about 85%. Just outstanding on folks feeling informed. What about feeling informed in a timely manner? Absolutely, the same thing. And especially if we look at parents, the timely manner is the most important. It's at 83%. What are folks' principal source of information? It's very different, not surprisingly. For the community as a whole, it's the newsletter, followed by the website, the grapevine, always has been, always will be alive and lush in Edina. It's 16% local newspaper and the e-newsletter and email. For parents, it's dominated by electronic. It's email and and e-newsletter, followed by the website, and then the newsletter. How do they prefer to receive information? If we look at this, I noticed you look at this push versus pull, print versus electronic. For the community as a whole, do they want to hold something in their hand? 29% say the district newsletter, 9% say the local newspaper. Just short of 40% want to hold something in their hand. On the flip side, on electronic, it's 16% website, the e-newsletter, social media. You have about 40% falling in that category. You do have parents. It's interesting. For the community as a whole, you have 1 in 10 people that prefer word of mouth. This is how the metropolitan area has become small town. As we've seen local newspapers disappear, not covered districts like they have been, there are many school districts that in the metro area, the #1 source is the grapevine. And people are fine with that. They love it. But so you do have a preference here of 11%. For parents, you do have 1 in 10 that prefer to receive their information from teachers and from employees, which is important to get that evaluation of how people feel about the teachers. And we saw that so extraordinarily highly rated. And then you can see the true impact of the grapevine. If we go through and ask individual sources, is it a major source, minor source, or not a source at all? What's a rate are the major and minor? If we look what leads the list, at the hierarchy of major, it's district newsletter. If we look at the combined, it's the informal discussions with friends and family at almost 75%. Nothing ever changes. The website, teachers and employees, social media, down the list. What about parents? Changes a little bit with the district website, but still you can see the heavy reliance on teachers and employees, the newsletter, e-newsletter, and then they also tap in to the friends, family, and other parents. What we typically has always been with the grapevine, it's always been predominantly parents. It's often centered around ECFE, early learning programs, and youth sports associations. The new dynamic into the grapevine is older men who used to read the newspaper, doesn't cover it like it used to. They're not going to go to the website. They're just going to go out for breakfast with their buddies and talk about it. And it just happens all across the metro area is the traditional thing going on. So with that, I could say overall a very positive study, a lot of rebounds in the overall assessment of the district that, those shifts that we saw. We still don't see, though, that shift back from good to excellent in the quality of education. That's, I call it the Gordian knot for K-12 education. The district that figures that out will be, have the most success. You know what people value. It's the broad curriculum for all. It's the success of students going on. And then looking at a potential bond referendum, it lines up. Obviously, this was a more general survey looking that we didn't test a package for the district to see how the community, it will cost X million dollars and it will be this amount. But at the outset, there's a willingness in the community to have a discussion about it. So I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Board members, what questions do you have for?
I guess I can go first. Sorry, I had to give a kiddo a ride, so I was listening under the live stream, but, I didn't hear this part, but, when we asked our questions, like on, slide 17 about concerns about curriculum, is that what we're hearing back? Is that pretty open-ended, or are we saying?
It's open-ended.
Okay.
Yeah, we have the questions phrased, do you have any concerns?
Mhm.
And you see the percent saying no.
Mhm.
And then if they say yes, then we say, what are those concerns? Yeah, so it's not, some districts have gone in depth and said, okay, let's test all of these curriculum areas and find out if people are concerned. In Edina, we've always just done the broad questions so they can tell us back if they have those concerns.
And that's, I was gonna say, I appreciate you guys for doing it that way, because I think it's a more rich answer. Looking at the referendum questions on slide 25, do we have a sense from respondents saying, I'm comfortable with $10 per month on my property taxes, or I'm comfortable with $30? Do we have a sense of where they fall on the property tax chart? Meaning like, are these
Oh,
respondents
yeah.
with, say, a $2 million home? Are these people with a $500,000 home? Because that's a different.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I mean, because it's such a broad spectrum in doing this. We always tell clients, apply the median, the median. So in this case, it's about $150 a year. Apply that to the average home in Edina.
Okay.
As you're calculating that. Now, I will also add for the caveat though, because you have such high support for all four components, but especially the top three, there's elasticity up on that number. The example I always use, Richfield about a decade ago. I came in with, a very more broader survey on the bond referendum, and it came in at $10 a month. And for that bond referendum, they had about 15 different components because they hadn't improved buildings in a long time. They had minimum 70% support for every single item, the entire list. They went for $27 a month because it will drive up support when people value what it is, and it passed 65-35. On the flip side, bed districts come under that number, throw in an ice arena or something people don't like, and then it'll fail. So that's at about $150 is kind of the starting point to realize, but you don't have a deal killer in the bunch here. So there would be potential, a willingness to go higher on that. Yep.
And then I want to talk a little bit about source of info, but I wanted to give kudos to our communications department, really, where I'm a newspaper guy. So the death of really local news kills me, but I'm really happy to see that our district website was #1, newsletters #3, newsletter was 4, social media was, district social media was 7. Earlier, we had talked about having a budget task force and maybe having communication linked to that. I just kind of bang that drum again, saying I think that would be important for us to do that, because I feel like that's where our parents are really getting information, and we can control that information. And otherwise, people are going to get it either way. And whether talking to friends or teachers or whoever, I would rather, if we can, continue to give that information, especially if parents are looking for it. I think that was all I have. Thank you for the information. I really appreciate it.
I'm curious with all the other surveys you're doing across the state, are you seeing for the future, not just about referendum, but just the future about trends of where things are going post-COVID and so on and so forth? Was there anything you saw in our results that's indicative of what you think the future is, in the positive or the negative? Something I'm just looking for an sort of future tensing for things, if there's anything. Good or bad?
Yeah, a couple things when it comes to, like I mentioned, people have the concern on the quality of education, and they have a fundamental dissonance on education funding.
Yes.
They are more confused now than ever on the adequacy of funding. It is driven by the governor and the legislature's victory laps in 21 and 23. And then at the same time, hearing district after district making cuts.
Yeah.
People don't know what to think about it. We do multiple statewides as a company, because my business partner, I can't stand it. When you have your own phone bank, you can just do surveys and then you share it with clients. We're gonna do another one because there's something we need to tap in to try to understand with what happened in November. It's not enough to discount that only 40% of school districts passed a referendum in November because of the presidential race. Because if you look next door in Wisconsin, Trump won that state and 80% of school districts passed their referendum.
Mm.
So you have a very clear, you have a counterexample right next door. And there are many theories and many hypotheses that we want to tap into. It goes just beyond the adequacy of funding question. But I mean, yours still remains. I mean, yours would be the envy. Because like you can have shifts, you know, the ebbs and flows, if it's from excellent to good or strongly agree to agree, that's easier to rebound. It's easier to make somebody go from good to excellent than only fair to good. That requires a conversion process. A lot of districts we see in the data are in the position they're gonna have to start changing people's minds. You're not in that position. The goal now is increasing the enthusiasm by showing them, you know, what they value, the broad curriculum, the success of the students, the academic quality, all of those sorts of aspects.
Do you think that there's a more specific survey that we should be considering doing in the next 6 to 12 months to get at, not just from the referendum standpoint, but when we look at the serious issues that people were raising even though none was the greatest category, but in terms of the lack of funding or the staff shortages, they're all interrelated to one another because they don't understand the connective points to those things. Do you think that we need to dig down deeper into understanding what people's?
Well, it sounds odd for a vendor to say no, but I would say no.
Okay,
Yeah, I mean, because it's not unusual.
okay,
If there was something that made me scratch my head and say, this might warrant, there's nothing atypical in that. You know, I would suggest always, you know, if you do go for a bond referendum, you would want to test a specific package. I mean, that's just the history. Excuse me. But as far as what I see in the data to dive down, I think, you know, and I'll share with the superintendent and, you know, I'll do it with AMSD and SBA and School Board Association, all of that. When we do our own survey, I think that data will shed more light on what's going on and can be applied down. So sounds odd, but
no, I appreciate that, thank you.
Yep.
I don't have a question, but I do, about that communication slide, and Elliot kind of talked about it too. To me, that's one of the bright spots. I mean, there was a lot of bright spots. I think there's a lot of great things happening. But, you know, when we think about those older, or people, I should say, the people that do not have children in the schools, I know one of the things that we'll sometimes hear is when your children age out, all of a sudden you get cut off from any kind of district communication. And that might be an opportunity for us to either allow parents to opt in or allow just general public to receive the buzz, because there are so many wonderful things that are happening, and it'll give them a glimpse, especially now with the Sun Current being male only, an opportunity for us to be the source of information into households that don't have children.
I mean, I would agree. Whatever, you know, the tension always with electronic, it's the push versus pull nature of it. And that's when you find pretty consistently, if somebody's not a stakeholder in something, they're not gonna go pull the information. And so any opportunity you have to give them that if they wanna pull it, I would absolutely allow that. I mean, it's a whole different world. You know, and mostly, you know, when your kids graduate, you're done.
Right.
And you're excited about that. But I think any opportunity you can have, because you do not have, I mean, from the results, you do not have a poisonous grapevine. But, you know, nature abhors a vacuum, and it depends what goes into that grapevine. So as much, you know, I think to your point, it's the newsletter, it's the website, they're getting the information from the school district. It's not somebody else, it's not Facebook post, it's not any of that. I think that those opportunities, I think it's a way to offer a pull source from a push. Yeah, I think it's.
And
great.
knowing that so much of our city does not have, I mean, I know at one point the statistic was like 2/3 of households don't have children. And so if it's that men's group at having breakfast and one of the men has read the newsletter, that then becomes what is being
Absolutely.
shared with that group. So that was just kind of where I thought, like, how do we capitalize on that?
Yeah, and I think all those tactics are played. The example I always used years ago, Roger Giroux, the former superintendent of Anoka Hennepin, for their referendum in 2003, 2004, the epicenter of the largest school district, the Grapevine, the epicenter of Anoka Hennepin was the Hardee's on Main Street in Anoka. There are about 50 guys that on a regular basis had breakfast. For those 6 months leading into the referendum, Roger went and had breakfast once a month with that group. Because back in those days, you could not, email was in its infancy and everything. He wanted to be sure that the district was providing the information going into that grapevine. So to your point, that's an effective way to do it in the modern age, the electronic way. You just need one person. So if you hear something, social media said this, no, actually I got this from the newsletter, this is the case. I think it's a fantastic way to look at it.
Now you can think about hot ham and cheese at Hardee's.
Yeah.
And some curly fries.
The Hardee's has gone down and
Right,
okay, used to
there's
be my
not very many
favorite.
Hardee's around,
Yeah.
so.
My wife is happy it's gone.
Board members, any final questions?
I have one more, I guess. This is more just general. Okay. Have you witnessed any fatigue, and we're talking about districts that go out for levies. Have you witnessed any fatigue in districts that have gone out for operating and failed, a couple of years? Do you notice any fatigue in voters at that point, or is it more just the district didn't maybe convert enough of those people from no's to maybes?
The fatigue, I'm sorry, the first fatigue is always with the volunteers,
Okay.
right off the bat, when you do that. If you do it well, and that's why I don't believe in dress rehearsals. I've had, some superintendents, well, we always have to fail the first one. No, then the public's exhausted, your volunteers are exhausted. You don't do dress rehearsals, you go out to win. But for, some districts through the years, like Lakeville in the 90s, with the growth, it was every November. We need an elementary school, middle school, 2 more elementary schools when you're in that situation where there would be fatigue with voters, you have to tell them the whole story. You don't just give them a chapter. I was just talking to a superintendent today saying, okay, we're gonna do a bond referendum this year and an operating levy the following year. Okay, you just don't ignore the operating levy, it's part of the story. And you make them understand, and that can overtell, oh, they're coming again. Because like I said, 80% of people have no idea if it's the idea between a bond and operating. So you can overcome it with effective communication as long as you don't lose. That's the key. You don't want to be like some districts. One called me and said, well, we've lost 6 times in a row. And I like, call somebody else to help you. But that becomes fatigue because it's always if you can lose one, you lose the second one, it goes from heck no to never. And then that's really a monumental shift. But the fatigue portion, it's more volunteers than anything else. Opponents will say they're always asking, but the community as a whole, no.
Okay, well, thank
All
you,
right.
Peter. It's good to
Pleasure.
see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right, and then next up on our agenda, we have our superintendent search update from the governance committee. So just as a reminder that at our December 19th special meeting of the board authorized the governance committee to begin work on gathering information about the current hiring landscape, timeline, short and long-term options, and potential search firms. So since that meeting, the governance committee has been working on gathering this information to provide to the full board for further discussion. So the time tonight is to provide the board and the public with the opportunity to hear about the information that's been gathered and ask questions, provide reactions, and discuss our next steps. So before we dig into this document, does anybody have any questions? Okay, all right. And if anyone is watching at home, there is a document on the board packet that we'll be working through this evening. And just so Dan, the governance committee, which is Dan Aram, Erica Ellenberg, and myself, have been working since that December 20th meeting, looking at, and you can see on this document, the top two bullets, began looking at search firms and going down that pathway, as well as exploring and gathering information around the interim superintendent option. So those were kind of the two options that the board discussed on the 20th that the governance committee was to look at. So we want to just make sure that the public understands the board is working hard to make sure that we are exploring all options, gathering as much information as we can. So the work to date that's happened in the last couple of weeks is the governance committee has done an assessment of executive search firms and has a recommendation of 3 to 4 for us to further look at. And we've also done a landscape analysis by contacting Minnesota School Board Association and other experts in the field, and by looking at industry research on superintendent searches. So the next area on your document is a landscape analysis. And here are some of the things that we learned as we had these conversations. One, we're gonna start with the challenges. The pool of superintendents is increasingly getting smaller. And some of that is due to the stress of the position, the changing landscape of public education, and what is required of the role. We also heard from individuals that there are people that have their superintendent license, but are maybe not at all interested in ever moving into that position because of some of those factors of how difficult the position is. You'll also see here the likelihood of attracting a superintendent from a like district from a different state is extremely small. So that was something that we asked around about. And it was interesting to learn, and you'll see this on page 2 of the document. Superintendents in our consortium schools make significantly more than Minnesota's superintendents tend to. So for us to be an attractive draw on a national search, it doesn't mean we shouldn't look at that, but it's something to consider that oftentimes superintendents are making upwards of $100,000 more. And so it would have to be very enticing for us to be able to attract. You'll see here that we were able to discover in the last several years, there have been examples of districts who have attracted out of state. One of those, the finalist for Minneapolis, one of the finalists was from Chattanooga, Tennessee. Minnetonka, a couple years ago, had a finalist from Ohio, Upper Arlington, who was offered the position but then turned it down. Duluth hired a superintendent from Wisconsin back in 2020, and Kasson-Mantorville hired their superintendent from Iowa in 2023. So that's just to help you kind of understand share with you some of the information that we learned. We also, as we started to look around, there's a lot of superintendents at larger or like districts that have been in place for many years and are likely at the end of their careers and not necessarily looking to make a move. So that was some of the landscape challenges that initially we were able to discover. Then I'll talk a little bit about the assets, and then I'll stop and see if anybody has any questions so far. I think these are really, so the first bullet point here, our district is seen as a marquee district across the state of Minnesota and a desirable place to work. That came up time and time again, and I really do not think it was just because they were talking to us. We've heard this several times from various entities, individuals, as well as organizations. The second bullet point there is that our board is seen as a functional, desirable board to work with. And you don't have to, I'll just leave that there. People that we spoke to, again, experts in the field, felt pretty confident that we will be able to attract a robust group of candidates if we decide to go that way. And I thought this was an important piece of information to include in here. The average superintendent search in Minnesota is actually 3.5 months, with most lasting between 3 and 6 months. So I went in thinking it was a much longer runway, and was, doesn't mean that we can't take longer, but I was surprised to learn that, I also learned that many districts, this is the busy time. Like many of the search firms are doing, I think 70%, I was told 70% of the searches are taking place starting after the new year. So that was some feedback that we learned as we looked. I'll stop right there. Are there questions that people have? Or Dan, do you want to add anything about anything we've talked about so far?
No, I feel like we're covered.
Keep going, okay. Now we move into the search firm refinement. So if we go with this pathway, this is the list, this list of 8 criteria was what the board discussed on the 20th. And this is what the governance committee was tasked with, using this list of criteria to kind of evaluate some of the search firms that we looked at. And one of the questions we'll be looking for from the board tonight is how many firms would the board want to interview? The governance committee is recommending the top 3 on this list to further investigate, with the idea that we would come back to you at the work session on the 21st, with more information about those top 3, and then the board would decide, yes, we want to move forward with these 2 or all 3, and then we would all be involved in the interview of those search firms. So you'll see here the top 3 that the governance committee is recommending at this point is School Exec Connect. That is the search firm that the district used last time. They're very, very knowledgeable about Edina, the state of Minnesota. They've completed searches for Anoka Hennepin, Brainerd, Burnsville, Chaska, Wayzata. They have experience with high-performing districts, especially in Illinois, such as Lake Geneva, Lake Forest, and New Trier. They specialize in working with boards of education and superintendent searches, and it's a recommendation from the governance committee. Hazard Young is the second one that's being recommended. They are located in Arlington Heights. They were a finalist for the board for the last superintendent search. They specialize in working with boards and superintendent searches. They are more of a national search company and have experience in Minnesota, but they're not as extensive in Minnesota as some of those other search companies. And again, this is a recommendation from governance. And then the third one that the governance committee felt confident with maybe moving forward with is Ray and Associates. They specialize in educational executive leadership searches. They're recognized by the School Administrator, which is a journal, as one of the top search firms in the country. They're located in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. They do have a local presence here. So those are the 3 top that the governance committee felt comfortable or would recommend we move forward from. You'll see other ones listed down below too, and I'll let you look at those in terms of, or ask further questions if you'd like to about those.
I have one question. On our category of consideration from a cost, do we have a particular budget range of costs related to executives or superintendent search for this process?
Can I put you on the spot here?
Absolutely.
What is the average cost of a superintendent search?
I don't know the average cost. I know that Edina paid $22,220 in May of 2021 to acquire the current superintendent.
Are most agreements based on some percentage of the salary, or is it a flat service cost based on the time or whatever it is?
I would assume it's an hourly rate.
An hourly rate, okay? Thank you.
And that's a great question, Michael. Those would be things that, the next steps with the firms, that the governance committee would be tasked with going and exploring. We would be asking for an RFP from each of these organizations, so we would have that information for the work session on the 21st.
I'm asking this question also for the community, in
Yeah.
case anyone is, and I'm also looking forward to this conversation probably on Wednesday when I'm at one of the buildings. I'm sure I'm gonna get asked. So I just wanted to make sure we're understanding from a broad spectrum. We haven't talked about this in the finance committee. We don't, this is not a specific line item budget that we currently have, but there's a budget for the school board, whatever it is that's there. I just wanna make sure that we're at least thinking about what the budgetary costs are related for this type of work.
I appreciate that. Any other questions at this point?
Yeah, I guess I have one.
Yeah.
As far as with, say, Hazard Young, we talked a little bit about some of the, challenges in, say, national searches and how that maybe isn't something, or if we want to pursue that, just doing so with eyes open. And Hazard Young was listed as more of a national search company, but has experience in Minnesota. And like BWP and Associates has more, or has some local experience. My question is, Hazard Young being national but still having local experience, is that local experience still more broad than BWP? Or do we know that, I guess? Or what's the size of both? Does that make sense?
It does make sense, and I will tell you that the person on our governance committee who looked up Hazard Young is not here this evening,
Oh.
so I cannot answer that question.
That's fine.
But I think it's a really good question in terms of, and we might walk away tonight and say, hey, we want the governance committee to look at 4 of them, and we want to include. There is some other additional information that's not on this sheet that, that fed into some of our recommendations. But I think it's a reasonable question to say, hey, you'll see the other ones, like MSBA has done a lot in a lot of other districts around us. We felt that they've done a lot of work with rural and smaller districts, so we maybe didn't necessarily recommend them over others. However, the board might decide, this is a board decision. So certainly if you want us to go out and bring back more information about any of these, that's an option.
Yeah, we were trying to mainly get to the reasonable number,
Sure.
then try to factor in like that we're gonna have to all interview those firms and whatever. So
I think the question is really in my opinion, for tonight also is, do we want to emphasize looking for in-state people, given that that's more of the likelihood, given the challenges that are identified? And then we really want to make sure that the search firms have a very strong ability to engage, attract, find, evaluate, whatever it is, present people from Minnesota that'll be likely for this. So I think that's how I'm taking all this question, is sort of like, unless we think, no, even with the challenges that have been presented, there could be a wonderful national candidate out there somewhere who might say this is a wonderful opportunity and so on and so forth, but that's not our emphasis. So if someone brought us somebody, that's great, but we would expect the majority of candidates to probably be at least local in the sense of our region. It could still be someone from Wisconsin, it could be someone from Iowa, it could be someone from the Dakotas, whatever. But it's not gonna be someone from Los Angeles, most likely, unless it's a Minnesotan who's now trying to find a way back to Minnesota, a la a wonderful principal that we brought back to Minnesota at Valley View. So I'm just curious as to the group's thinking around that part of the presentation. Do we assume that it's just gonna be a Minnesota person and that's what we wanna emphasize, or are we wanting to take more of a larger funnel approach to work our way down? I'm just curious in people's thoughts on that.
I guess I have thoughts if somebody.
What's that?
I said, I have thoughts. I guess in hearing that from, just national candidates and knowing, in the past, seeing just kind of executive position searches, whether it's police chiefs, things like that. It seems like there's always there's 3 candidates that are brought in. There's always kind of a national candidate brought in. Seeing those kind of difficulties in it, I personally would like to have a more local candidate in the sense of someone that knows the context of Edina, the state of Minnesota, the Twin Cities metro area. For me, that might be more important than someone who's been a superintendent necessarily already in Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, what have you. Similar to the last search, the candidate we got was a person who had experience in all that context, had not been a superintendent yet, but was ready to make that jump. For me, that I think would be more important, if that makes sense. If that answers your question. That would be more important to me than maybe someone from Illinois, because I think that that's a harder bit to kind of jump into, but that's just my.
And at this point, it's really about the search firms.
Yeah.
Like the search firms, many of them, many of them, if not all of them, can do that Minnesota and can bring in candidates from both.
Okay.
Like last time, School Exec Connect, one of our finalists was from Texas.
Mhm.
And so I think they all have that capability, but you're right, at some point, the board might say, we prefer, because we will, if we go down this road, many people will have a chance to weigh in on what our superintendent profile will look like, and that might be something that comes up.
Other thoughts? Any others? Then I think the recommendations you guys is good. I think I agree with Elliot. I think if BWP and Associates, I would say for this first part, having a 4th company to at least engage with, given that we had used them before, they understand us, so on and so forth. Unless there's something from our former chair who's not here and is the only one on the board who had experience with those searches, has some more specific reasons to not, I would say add them as a 4th component for you guys to kind of work through, figure it out, and then come back with, your top, what you think is right.
Or yeah, maybe there's something where Director Allenberg would say, well, I like this better about hazard, and that would be great.
But I think 4 is reasonable.
Yeah,
If
4 is
everybody,
excellent.
if everybody
I
here
don't-
thinks we can do 4, I think, Dan, I feel like we could take on
Yeah,
4.
and I think when we send an RFP to them, that'll add more criteria to rule out people and narrow their funnel. So I have no inclination to say we're only sending an RFP to 3 and that's it. It means if we don't like the response to an RFP from one or the other, then we just.
Well, I think on this part too, because, from a budget, notwithstanding the costs that we might have had in 21, costs probably have gone up, I would think reasonably considerably, just from inflation and everything else that's going on. It would be nice to get a good sense of, from a budgetary standpoint, of what people would say is the price point for there, to make sure that we're getting both good value, but also good service from that standpoint. So I think 4 is a good way to kind of get that feeling, probably then whittle it down from there.
We'll know how networked people are probably.
If governance is fine with that, I don't want
No, I'm fine with that.
Paralysis by
Cheryl, are you
analysis.
fine with
Yeah,
that?
that sounds good. I appreciate the work you guys are doing.
Jen, you okay with that? Okay, we'll plan then 4 then. Okay, then on the bottom of the 3rd page, the recommended board structure, I know on the 20th, it was talked, at least the idea was placed on the table of, historically, the governance committee has been the point of contact for doing some of this work, and the question was asked, well, do we, because our governance committee is also tasked with all the other board things right now, do we have maybe a task force? And we talked about this a little bit, and the governance team is recommending that it stays with the governance team due to the redundancy of likely board members on the search firm. So if you look at this, Erica's the only one of us that's done a search. So she would make the most sense for her to be on that committee that's screening, well, at least screening the information to come to the further board. And she had shared that historically you put the chair on there too. So then that's 2 of those spots taken, and you end up running the risk of breaking open meeting law if you don't keep that 3rd, was the recommendation. Now, if the board is no, this is the work that's been done by the 3 of us, we can certainly pivot if people are I think we should do it a little different. But the recommendation was to limit the amount of meetings that other people are having to attend, and also, potential open meeting violations with that.
Just to clarify, I didn't have a problem with the governance committee doing that. It was more of a bandwidth issue. that
Yeah, and I
there's
really
already-
appreciate that.
When I think about the LAC work that's going on and so on, sort of that Dan's would be a part of on top of everything else, notwithstanding the chair and vice chair on it, that's what I was concerned about, was that the bandwidth issue is that you're not consolidating a lot of stuff on a very few number of people. That was my only concern.
And I appreciate that.
All righty, you guys really want to carry that rucksack up the hill?
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so, potential pathways, as you've heard, and this is similar to what we recapped on the 20th. There are 3 pathways we're looking at, but it's kind of 2. So one, would be to go the interim superintendent route. We will be needing information from Dr. Stanley regarding her contract negotiations with St. Paul Public Schools and that involving contract release negotiations with the Edina School Board. So there'll need to be some negotiations that take place, because we don't know if we go that route, when that person would be needed. And then if it's needed for B here, it says if it's needed for the short term and potentially the next school year in order to give Edina a longer timeline for finding a superintendent. So that is one of the pathways. Pathway 2 is what we've been talking about most of this evening, which is going down the route of a search firm, hiring a search firm to hire the next Edina schools superintendent. And then number 3 is really evaluating past Edina administrators or administrators within the system to kind of see if they'd be interested in 1 or 2, and just doing a little bit of a temperature read and seeing, making sure we're having conversations and we've had the information that the board feels they need to move forward. So those are still the pathways that we're looking at. And then if you turn to the very last page, so based on our conversation tonight, the governance committee will return to the board at the work session on the 21st to bring forth further recommendations, including each of those pathways, so the interim route or the search firm. We will also at that point bring you information about those search firms. We've already, it sounds like, done number 2. We've narrowed the search firm list to 3 or 4. We've got 4 to consider as semifinalists, and the governance committee will gather more information on those firms to recommend to the full board on the 21st. If the board moves forward with hiring a search firm, tentative target interview completion will be by the end of the week of January 24th. And at the January 21st work session, the board will have a short overview of the interview process and recommended interview questions. And then the third point there is making sure we've been thinking through how do we make sure that our community is engaged and updated on this process. And so some of the things that we've brainstormed is a separate tab on a website. A lot of districts do that, where they just have a superintendent search tab. Weekly updates in community and staff newsletters. They can be short or just say, click here if you want more information. Monthly board updates. So we can, at the board meetings, just have a standing item where we just discuss what has taken place. And we really felt pretty strongly that emails directly to the community only as needed for major updates. And that really came from, I think we want to be judicious.
Well, it's a little bit like they were talking about in the principal source of
Right.
information that just happens to be up there still. It's like people looked for certain standard communication documents from us, whether it's the in the know or, those types of things. We want to try and leverage stuff that people are used to looking at, more so than anything, just so that we're there, not having to attend to one other.
And I think it's a minor update. I think we also run the risk of then people don't start reading our emails. If it's like, oh, there's not much they're telling us anyway. So, so those are kind of, that's at least what we've prepared, but I'm really interested to hear responses, thoughts. We still would have, with both pathways, we still have conversations we're having and gathering information on both. So even though we talked a lot about the search firm tonight, don't take that as like the governance committee is thinking that's the route we should go. We really, we've been gathering a lot of information on both of the pathways.
I think my question on the potential next steps is the work session on the 21st. At that time, the way I'm reading your bullet points is that, okay, we're making then a decision about which search firm, if we're gonna go with a search firm, that's the pathway we take. Then there's a decision on which one it is, because you're then saying tentative target interview completion by the end of week of 24. Is that referring to the search firms, or is that referring to candidates for the
Search
firm?
Search.
Excuse me, okay, that was a little unclear in the way that was written. Okay,
Not that close.
sorry, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm good now, thank you. I mean, I was like,
Clear.
wow, that's 3 days, that's pretty,
It's a robust 3 days.
That's right.
yeah, that's
It's busy, third, yeah.
okay, sorry, thank you. Seems good to me.
Everyone okay with that? Jen, do you have questions?
So you just made a comment, that we're talking about search firms today, but there's other things going on. So I'm assuming that 3 potential pathways are sort of in play within the governance committee. And I just wanted to make that very clear for anybody who's listening or something, that we're talking about this today. It's not necessarily 100% path that will be taken. The potential pathways are all in play at this time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we don't even know what date we're talking about at this point. So, that's a big thing out there that will certainly play a role in our next steps.
So go back to Director Bergman's question about the 21st and then the 24th. It almost seems to lead us that we're going down that path. Or is that just sort of informational?
That's just
At that point,
informational, so
too?
that we as a board are prepared, so don't come on the 21st and we're like, hey, FYI, for the next 3 days, some of us are interviewing. From what I understand last time, they interviewed as several on a night. So like, we might do all 4 of them
Mm-hmm.
on one night, but it might be that Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and it would be based on when all of us can be there. So the reason we wanted to put that on people's radar is so that it wasn't like, you have a couple weeks to prepare that week is when we might be doing these interviews.
And then some time for the firm to prepare a response, that kind of thing. So we're just working backwards from,
That's what I was thinking, like RFP returned and then.
Right.
Back and forth.
I think the thing that's also important, and it was stated in here, but clearly there's a whole thing about the timing of stuff, because Dr. Stanley is working with St. Paul to figure out what her story is gonna be. There has to be a negotiation as far as, okay, how long is she here for, so and so, whatever it is, which then kind of helps set up a timeline for, okay, what do we like, but we don't wanna wait till know every single detail of that, then start our process. We're trying to get our ducks in a row to say, okay, maybe it's an interim process either for a short period of time or at least for another year. Could be a search firm that's looking out for the person, we can hire them for July 1, maybe that's the solution, or some combination of the two. That's how I look at your 3 pathways, is that it's kind of, we're not quite sure where that's gonna go. We wanna make sure that we're at least putting some effort into that part. This is sort of the clarification, that how I interpreted what this was. I think that's the right intention. I think you're covering the right basis for that, given that we don't have all these things settled. And they will be settled probably within the next 30+ days. At least some of it we'll know, and we can then tighten it up from there. But this seems like a good, reasonable pathway to look at that. And while you're looking at interim options and looking at past people related to Edina to see if that's a possible intermediate step, whatever it is, those are all viable. I think we did talk about those at the past meeting. Those are all the right things that the governance committee or this group is doing from that standpoint. We'll see what comes to play to go from there. Thank you for the summary. Now that I think that's helped me figure out where that, does that kind of gel with what you saw it as?
Yes, and
Okay.
as I'm looking at this a little bit more, if the board moves forward with hiring a search firm, then the tentative target interviews on the week of the 24th. But if we're not meeting till the 21st to even talk about like what next steps are gonna be.
We might, that's why we put tentative.
Yeah.
Like, we might get to the 21st and things might evolve in the next 2 weeks where it's like, oh, no, that's not
Right,
going to happen.
right.
But we also, again, wanted to make sure that,
Mhm.
you know,
We weren't waiting a month for
Right.
like, waiting to start the process of interviewing and search
We're
for
trying
somebody.
to, we're trying to hit the regular meeting schedules and all that. you know.
So what I would say here is that, to your point, you guys are really trying to indicate that we had a sense of urgency to want to move forward with a process as things happen. So it's tentative, not knowing exactly the timing of certain things, but it's the intention that if we decide to go down that pathway, we're gonna move quickly on that.
Yeah.
Is that a better way to summarize?
Yeah, I mean, we're factoring in, like, obviously, like, the superintendent searches for, other open available ones are ramping up in January.
Yeah.
We're trying to make sure that we're not, we're getting ourselves in the best position in the district to make it.
Do we have a sense for if there are many other districts or how many other districts are also seeking superintendents currently?
I don't, there's one that I have my eye on and we need to be very aware of, so keep an eye. So I don't, yes,
So we're taking steps.
we're
just to-
making sure that we're
Yeah,
positioning
okay.
ourselves in the best way possible.
Love it.
Okay, and as always, if board members have questions, I know I'm a person that needs to process for a while and then the questions come, so feel free to reach out to one of the governance committees if you have feedback or, hey, I thought about this and make sure we're doing this, please do that. Okay, thanks for your time on that. All right, next, our last item for discussion tonight is the EPS academic calendars for the 2026, 2027, and 2027-2028 school years. I'd like to welcome up Assistant Superintendent Nate Swenson and Executive Director of Human Resources Sonia Saylor to lead us in this discussion.
Good evening, everyone. Madam Chair, members of the board, Dr. Stanley, good to see you all. So the calendar committee has thoughtfully designed the academic calendar to maximize instructional effectiveness while accommodating key breaks and professional development needs. You'll notice the calendar prioritizes educational continuity by maintaining full weeks of instruction and also aligns non-student days with cultural observances when possible. Student breaks are strategically distributed throughout the year, including MEA, Thanksgiving, a 2-week winter break, and spring break, with careful attention given to balancing semester lengths and maintaining consistent weekly learning schedules. The structure aims to support both student learning and staff professional development while respecting community preferences and needs. We'd like to extend our sincere gratitude to our dedicated calendar committee, comprised of staff members and parents, for their thoughtful work in developing a calendar that serves our entire school community. At this time, Sonia is going to review some of the highlights of the calendars, and when she is finished, we'll be happy to hear about your initial reactions and take your questions.
May I just ask a really quick question? How many people make up the calendar task force?
18.
18 people.
And an important note on that as well is although there are 18 on the committee, what we would do is we would meet, we would talk through a draft. We would prepare a draft, give it to the 18, and then they would go out and talk to their colleagues, right? And come back to the next meeting with their suggestions for changes, suggestions for, with their suggestions, and then we would do that process again. And so although there were 18 on the committee, it actually.
Yes. The reason why I asked that, just before we start, is like to recognize how many humans it requires in order to come up with this amazing outcome that tries to parse it all together. In my short time on the board, 3 years, this is always the thing that blows me away more than anything, about all the moving parts related to that. So I just wanted to acknowledge that before you get to your presentation. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm just going to go through some of the highlights of our proposed 26, 27, and 27, 28 academic calendars and kind of really talk about really what is present in both of them and a few things that are slightly different in the two. You probably have found that they actually lay out in a very similar fashion. One of the years is a leap year, and so we end up really close lining up in those 2 years, but both begin the week before Labor Day, and that's to accommodate summer construction. And just to remember, in our guiding change document, the board's parameters, one of the things is it was set out that there would be 10 years worth of construction, summer construction, that would far exceed the amount that's allowable in order to have a before Labor Day start. And we have about 6 years of that left at this point, is my understanding. So both of these would keep in line with that before Labor Day start. Both contain 2 connect and assess days for our kindergarten through grade 5 before the first day of student arrival. And that in both of them, the connect and assess days were moved from Monday and Tuesday of the first week to Friday and Monday. And that was a change, if you remember, this year we did, because our faculty actually brought forward, they would really like to have that Tuesday before kids arrive on site to review the data that they've collected over the course of those 2 connect and assess days. And so that worked out really well. So both of these calendars include that. So that means that on the week before Labor Day, on that Monday, our 6 through 12, grade 6 through 12 would begin. And on the Wednesday, our Early Learning Center and our K through 5 would begin on that day in full, normal, all students in school. Both calendars contain 3 data days. First one is day after semester 1. Second one is day after the last student day at the end of the school year. And then we have 1 floating data day, which is, so teacher data, that's a teacher data day for teachers to review their student data. And that, depending on the building, that's either in August or that's in June. But that floater day is either on one of those 2 ends each year. Both of these proposed calendars include a 2-day MEA break, a 3-day Thanksgiving break, a 2-week winter break, and a 1-week spring break. Also coming from what's historic in our school district, and also the board's guiding change document as well. Both that closely balanced semesters 1 and 2, with our 26-27 calendar having 84 days in semester 1, and our 27-28 calendar having 85 days in semester 1. This is very important, obviously, at all levels, but particularly at the secondary level, for them to have the same number of instructional days for kids in each of the semesters. Both contain no student days on the November election day, and in 27-28, it contains a no student day on the primary election day in March. And this, had a great conversation at the committee about this, as well as, of course, the board knows, many of our buildings are used as polling places, and it is a student safety issue in order to have students on site on those dates as well. Both calendars contain 1 PD day in the early fall. And again, aligning with the guiding change document, which our committee looks to be sensitive to cultures within the community. And also, which also aligns with our strategic plan initiative B3 to support equity by identifying and eliminating structural barriers to provide success. We did our best on both of those to align them with a cultural observation in the early fall. So you can see in the first year calendar, that date happens to fall on Yom Kippur, which is in later September. In the second year calendar, that date will fall on a Friday, which is the day before Rosh Hashanah, because Rosh Hashanah falls on a Saturday. Both contain, no student days on the Tuesday attached to President's Day. One of the things that we do as part of the committee, in addition to looking at all the moving parts, is try to figure out, okay, how many days will kids be gone in that semester on a particular weekday? And that's to try to ensure that kids that are receiving special services do not consistently miss them if we're gone many Mondays or many Tuesdays. And so we do our best to balance it. It is hard because most of our holidays fall on Mondays, but we do where we can fit in a Tuesday, we try to do that, right? Because especially if it can still continue with the educational continuity for kids, like attaching it to a Monday holiday. So it has been, for a number of years, that Tuesday after President's Day is a PD day, so it makes it a 4-day weekend for families at the same time, and gives us a Tuesday as opposed to a Monday. Both the last student days both work out where they fall on the Friday of the week that begins with Memorial Day. That's again back to that having a leap year in there as well. So we talked about, so we had to place some kind of PD/conference dates in the spring. And so we have in both of them that there's one day in March and one day in April. And we specifically talked about how having that March date works really well for elementary schools because they have fast bridge data by that time in order to share with families at conferences. And then we also talked about having a late April date. Our middle schools like that because they felt like that would help with it not falling in the middle of the MCE math window. And it also provides a little bit of a break for students and for our educators kind of halfway between that spring break time and the end of the school year as well. And I think that's all of the highlights. Are there any questions? Board members, any questions?
I appreciate you acknowledging the different board parameters that we put for both the special services as well as the diversity in terms of different cultural beliefs within the population. I've seen that now the last couple of years, and it's like, you can see it clearly as it's delineated there. I really like the whole Monday, Tuesday part. So there's less of the Monday you're on than the rest of the year. So I just want to acknowledge that that's in line with when the board at the time created that. That's meeting those expectations. So thank you.
There's an astonishing amount of thought and consideration put into this planning, so thank you, and the whole team. A lot of work.
It's actually kind of fun as well. It's hard to believe, but we actually have a lot of fun. It's a great committee, but they bring such great ideas to it.
I'm still just waiting for some high schooler to create an AI package that does this for you. There's a great business opportunity there for anyone listening.
Outside the table, anybody have any questions? I have one question. On March 2027, there is a week where, and I'll let you get to it. There is a week where the no student day is a Friday, but the Monday of that week is when Ramadan ends, and then it's Eid on Tuesday, Wednesday. And I need a little refresher on that holiday. My concern there, you know where I'm going, is would we have students that would be out Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then not have school on Friday? Or is that holiday only, is it Eid where they would be off school if they celebrate?
So, because we talked a lot about doing our best to try to accommodate Eid if there was any way to, this year, this year's calendar, 24-25, we were able to actually plan spring break. We were able to plan, spring break around Eid. But we talked a lot about the potential of using that week as spring break. And then we talked, it was difficult because it put it a little too early in March for coming back from winter break, and particularly again at the secondary level. They felt like they needed more time prior to going out on spring break. We talked about again, it was in an attempt to balance out a little bit some of the early days in the week versus the later days in the week. And the one thing too that we have learned, it's been a great cultural learning experience for us too, is although we placed Eid on here, we won't really know when Eid will begin until probably a week or two before the actual date. And so we did make the decision to go with, the committee made the decision to go with the Friday in that case. But that's a very good question, and yes, it is, that possibility is there.
Okay, well, I appreciate that was discussed and talked about, and also understanding, like everyone else has said, I mean, we can't even get a family week at the cabin with 5 people, so I can't imagine planning the calendar for 8,500 people.
And I think going back to that balance, right, it's like, the goal also was not to every year have one group be somewhat, if you allow, disadvantaged by the choices that we're making. There's like this, it's a little bit like this, like, so maybe in 26, 27, we're able to do more protection on doing a Tuesday rather than a Monday, or that kind of, so it's not always Monday where it's really hard in the special services part. Whereas you said 24, 25, we're able to more with the scheduling deal with this, but in 26, 27, we won't be, just because of the circumstances of the lunar calendar versus the Roman calendar, so on and so forth. There's all those factors in there. So I think it's just that, what I remember when we talked about it originally, when we instituted that, it was trying to be like this, that it's never gonna have one group consistently be disadvantaged based on the choices of the calendar. And I think that was also from of the collegial part of the team as well, was trying to kind of articulate from that standpoint. So I think you're right. That's a great thing to point out. I think it's also just to look at a reflection over a 3 to 4 year period of time. It's a little bit like this. It's not really consistently across the board.
No.
And it's hard because those change every year when they show up.
They do change every year, and we looked at, in both years, we looked at trying to figure out how we might be able to accommodate Eid around spring break, and it's just these 2 calendars, unfortunately. In the second year, Eid is in February, and so it just, unfortunately, just would not work with these 2 calendars.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your work, and it was more of a concern of just if we had a week where, and it's awareness, right? Like you said, I mean, we might not be able to accommodate every year, but just letting those families as well as our teachers know you might have students that are missing a couple days that week. So, yeah. All right, any further questions, board members? Great. Well, Nate and Sonia, do you have the information? I mean, I think that was the green light to go forward. So,
Yeah, thank you.
And we will plan on bringing this to discussion at the next meeting.
yes, so this will come up for discussion at the February board meeting, and then it will be voted on for action in March.
Great.
So thank you both.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, good work, team. All right, leadership updates. Does anybody have any committee updates for the work session? Okay, I have a couple. Our retreat. The board has been working to try to find a retreat date. We have been unsuccessful. And so for now, we are going to postpone our winter retreat. The thought around that from governance too was that if we are in the middle of the superintendent search and if someone new is coming on or in that position, it might be better for us to just pause on that for a second, figure this out, and then, and use that time for a new leader or to get ready for that. So is everyone okay with that? Okay, great. And then Berg sessions. We learned in December that the finance committee will be part of these sessions. And so finance committee, look for something probably from Ann, and I'll talk with you, Jen, maybe, to get up to speed on signing up for dates to attend that. That's okay. Okay. Dr. Stanley, do you have any updates? Okay, great. Then do I have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
So moved. Second.
All those in favor of adjourning the January 6th, 2025 work session, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The meeting is adjourned.